Good evening, gospel revolutionaries around the world. This is Michael Lilborn Williams coming to you live from the bonus room above my sister's garage in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. I have to try really hard not to drop that last part. Hey guys, thank you for joining. Seeing people already signing on that's here with me tonight. We're having a wonderful day. It's always a good day when you know you were redeemed with the entire rest of the world. It's always a good day when you know that. Do you know that? That's what we're communicating to you here in the Gospel Revolution, is the power of the gospel, which is nothing but good news, and that is that not only were you redeemed, so was the whole world 2,000 years ago. This is not being brokered by anybody. The gospel cannot be brokered by anybody, any denomination, any group, anyone, any doctrine. The gospel means good news. It's already happened. Too late. You can't take advantage of it. You can't broker what's already been done. Yikes. So here we are. We are wanting to share with you more gospel. Last time we went through verse 1 of Galatians chapter 6. However, it is just a 15-minute show, although I kind of go over sometimes. But here we go again. The book of Galatians, magnificent, a letter by Paul written to the Galatians about a fault that they were in that was caused by a fault that Peter was in, which was a fault that was there because of James. And these faults all were within what was known as Christianity at the time, and Paul was fighting against these faults that were there. So we're kind of taking up Paul's banner and wanting to follow through with this. We're also trying our best to follow our new discovery, and that is the writer of the book of Hebrews, Apollos, who learned from Paul and made it very clear that he did not learn this directly from Jesus like Paul did, but he learned it from some great teachers, and he sure did learn this from a great teacher, and that man's name was Paul. This book of Galatians has been picked over. So that's why we're trying to go into this in context, because that's the way that we will find the message that is here. You don't have to know Greek. You don't have to, it helps to understand some of these words that got grossly mistranslated. But even in the mistranslation, the context will help you see through the mistranslations. You'll see, you can see it. Long before I knew what the Greek context was, I saw this gospel laid out in context, and that was my mantra. It was context, context. People are almost sick of hearing me say it all the time. But now we not only know context, we understand the writer who is writing to, we accept what the problem was. We accept that chapter 6, verse 1, the fault that Paul is referring to was the one, the similar or any like that fault that he found Peter, James, and John to be in. They were at fault, and he said they were to be blamed, and he called them out to the face. Now in chapter 6, he says, if you find anybody in that condition, he says, you that are spiritual. Do you realize what he just said? Peter, James, and John were not spiritual. Because he confronted them. He said it takes a spiritual person. It takes somebody who's not under the law to correct these errors of judgment. When people get back under the law, your brain scrambles. I'm telling you, you start seeing things incorrectly. You read incorrectly. It's just an entire paradigm. But once you understand that you're under no law and that Jesus, the work of Christ, is not being brokered by the Catholics and the Baptists and the Presbyterians and the Mormons and blah, 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 on and on and on, 45,000 times, and subdivisions even of those, the gospel's not being brokered by these people. It's being distorted by them. Any of them that says that Jesus did not successfully redeem every human being on the earth is trying to broker the ones who they say are not. Sorry, we're taking your job from you because you've created the problems. You've told people they're going to hell. You've told people the end of the world's coming. You guys have told people these things and then sat back and watched the multitudes come in to listen to you to find the remedy for the problem you created. Doesn't sound very fair, does it? But that's exactly what happened. So what we're doing is trying to correct the fault that is out there. Then verse 2, he says, bear ye one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. If you're going to fulfill a law, don't make it the Mosaic law. Make it the law of Christ, which is just love. He said, just come in. Now this, the term burden here, it's, oddly, it's used 2 times and yet 2 totally different words in just a couple of verses here together. And he says, bear you one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. And that just means to bear the weight. Help bear each other's weight. Now, the only weight that we could assume out of this, because at this point we're not told what that weight is, except to look at this in context. What kind of weight was the church at Galatia under? They were under a weight trying to get them back under the law by James, the head of the church, Peter and John. Now, Paul did lose this battle. As you know, he said, all they that are at Asia have forsaken me. That includes this church. All they that are at Asia have forsaken me. Let that sink in. These people in this letter that Paul was addressing forsook him. He said so. That's what it says. He says, for if any man think himself to be something when he is nothing, he deceives himself. Now, you see, context. Who has Paul had in mind this entire letter? He's had James, Peter, and John in mind. With Peter, James, and John, especially James, who took control of the church, and there's absolutely no indication as to why that happened. There's nothing biblical, extra biblical. There's nothing scriptural about why except nepotism. He was the physical brother of Jesus Christ. So he says here, for if any man think himself to be something when he is nothing, he's deceived himself. Now we're going to talk about deception. This is what the theme begins to become here. Well, we've been talking about deception throughout this whole book. If any man be taken in a fault, that's a deception. All the way through this, he's been trying to reach into people's hearts and minds and bring them back into a full understanding of the gospel. Because he said that what Peter, James, and John had done, that it had literally erased the image of Christ out of these people's lives. Now, that's what happens when you get under the law. The image of Christ is erased, and you begin to see life through law for you and especially for others. Now, you'll excuse yourself a few times, and maybe more than a few, but I guarantee you really start finding fault with other people. There's a true fault, and maybe it's the one who's finding the fault that has the fault. That is the context of this letter that Paul wrote. If any man thinks of him, so what is the problem? What is the problem? Sex, drugs, rock and roll? No. What is the fault? Sex, drugs, rock and roll? No. Sin? No. Sin isn't the problem. The problem is going back under the law. Self-righteousness is the problem. Any man who thinks of himself more than he ought to when he is nothing, he's deceived. So what is the problem? The problem is self-righteousness. The problem is esteeming yourself. Remember, Paul said earlier in this letter, he said, they want you to be circumcised that they may glory in you. They want to, and he said, let your rejoicing be in yourself and yourself alone. Don't allow somebody to get you to obey their church rules or their laws and rules and regulations of their denomination or non-denomination. A lot of people call themselves a non-denomination. Doesn't mean you're not a legalist. Anything that reduces the work of the cross to something brokered by somebody else is legalism. The gospel is not to be brokered, folks. The gospel is just good news about what happened. You can't do anything about it. You can't. Only thing you can do is work real hard to get it to people's ears. You can't get them to do something so they can have what the gospel is all about, because all the gospel is about is the work of the cross, which is already done. It's already completed. You can't get somebody to say a prayer now. You're in. Where is that? Where in the world is that? Oh, well, we got to get people out there and get them to make Jesus their personal Lord. Where is that one? Goodness gracious. Yeah, goodness, it's been a good weekend for me. For if any man thinks of himself to be something when he is nothing, he deceives himself. But let every man prove his own work. And then shall he have rejoicing in himself alone and not in another. You see, this is still carrying that theme all the way through that Paul has had. If you want to do a good work, do it. Just do it. But don't get somebody else to do it so you can rejoice in what they've done, that you got them to do what you're doing. Man, not a good place to be. If you're going to do something, do it and just rejoice that you've done it in yourself. Don't let somebody else be rejoicing because they got you as a convert, because they got you in. Because nobody got you in but Jesus. He is the only one that got any of us in. And we're got in, folks. We are got in. We done got in. We're not trying to get in. You are free. You're free from the law. You're free. All scripture has been fulfilled. There's no future prophecy. Oh man, let's look and see where we are in prophecy right now. Let me tell you where we are. Finished. That's where we are in prophecy. It's called finished. Start living life. Start living on a planet that God gave us to begin to experience what it's like to be God in the earth. Start living and taking responsibility for yourself instead of blaming the devil, accusing God, pastor, minister, deacon. There's nobody to blame, folks. We just simply need to realize who we are and start taking responsibility for this magnificent condition we have found ourselves in. We have found ourselves in a magnificent condition. He says, for every man shall bear his own burden. Now, the word burden here, I'm going to tell you, it's not the same Greek word as the word burden in verse 2, but I have no reason, I have no clue what it means. I just called Don to say, give me something here, what's the difference? It means the same thing, it's just two different words, and one, it means a little different here than it is, of course, there. Context would probably tell us that, but I discovered that these words are here just a little bit too late to try to ferret this out. If anybody wants to get in and study this out, have at it. I'm not the only one who can do this. He says, let him that taught in the word communicate unto him that teacheth in all good things. Am I teaching you good things? And the word communicate, it really does mean just get support. It means to support. It means finances. It means whatever you can do to make the load easier on me, you should do. That's exactly what he's saying. And whatever we could do for anybody who is trying to pass this gospel on to somebody else, we should do what we can. And that's what we do in the Gospel Revolution. A lot of your contributions that come to us, we try to help people around the planet who are trying to do this very same thing in their own cultures, in their own way. We'll do whatever we can. But that's what that means. And we're just starting Pledge Drive this coming month in September. What a good place to jump off and just start talking about your money, and we want it. Let him that is taught in the word communicate unto him that teacheth in all good things. If we're not giving you good things, don't give us your money. and whoever you're giving money to, if they're not telling you that Jesus is the Redeemer of the whole world and that all prophecy was fulfilled, please don't send your money to these guys, because they're adding to the problem. I know they're nice. I know they love you. I know you love them. But don't support what is causing an extension of the problem that started 2,000 years ago. Then verse 7. This is, number one, verse 1 is taken completely out of context and misused. Now we're down to verse 7 and 8, and they are lifted completely out of context and used against you as a battering ram. Be not deceived, God is not mocked, for whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he reap. Now, we've not talked about sex, drugs, rock and roll. What are we talking about sowing? What are we talking about reaping? We're talking about either sowing to the Spirit or sowing to the flesh. When you're sowing to the flesh, what are you doing? You're trying to make yourself look good before God and man by trying to keep God's laws. That's what you're sowing to. If you're sowing to the Spirit, you're claiming righteousness through Christ and through Christ alone. There's only two options. In this letter, there's only two options. You have to pull all the other definitions completely out of thin air. They're not in this book. They're not in this letter. For whatsoever a man, I'm telling you, whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he reap. You ever seen anybody do bad things and get by with it? Heck, I've done a lot of good things and never reaped anything from it. A lot of people do bad things and never get, well, yes, but Mike, in the next life. Well, there you're wrong again, because God's not going to be punishing anybody in this life or the next one. Why? Because Jesus is Lord, because Christ took all of judgment. He said, if I be lifted up from the earth, I will draw all judgment unto myself. Please don't start brokering God's judgment too. People broker God's judgment. You don't have to broker God's judgment or God's salvation. Jesus is the one who fulfilled them both. We have no right to be going around brokering the judgment of God. He says, for he that soweth to the flesh shall reap corruption. Now, there's only one end to trying to be righteous through the law, and that's death. It's nothing but death there. Now, that's why people wind up in church and feel dead all at the same time. That's why you have to go back more often, more and more, and get pumped up and get going in hallelujah and you get into the music and now I feel good. Well, why don't you feel good all week long? Because somebody's brokered your salvation. That's why. Don't let somebody broker your salvation. You got it from Jesus. You didn't get it from the local denomination. You got it from Christ, not from anybody. He says, for he that soweth to the flesh shall reap of the flesh, reap corruption. But he that soweth to the Spirit shall of the Spirit reap life everlasting. Wow. In Christ, there is life everlasting. In the law, there's nothing but death. Oh, Mike, are you sure about that? Yeah, try out 1 Corinthians chapter 3, where Paul said that the law is the ministry of death. That's what he said. It's the ministration of death. That's what the law is. The law was there to bring about death. And it did bring about death, the death on the cross. I'm getting so caught up in this, and here I am running over. Goodness, we're going to have just... But see, if I change it to a 20-minute Bible study, then I'll start doing 30. We love you guys. We hope that this little study briefly here in Galatians chapter 6, don't let your brain get scrambled here. Just keep it in context. You can see it for yourself. Just don't. I know we've got to bear one another's burdens, because I know what you've heard. You know what I've heard in the past as to what all this means. If we just leave it safely in context, nobody has to broker this for us. All you got to do is read. Read in context. Context, context, context. It will save you every time. Love you guys.